the lesson of this subject. For the first time, recreation room. Each of the students found this place the only possible place to finally exhale calmly. It was difficult to relax in their life, in the life of students. Lihan gathered at this location with his friends to share with them his really important information that this item could not be missed in any way, because everyone is guaranteed to get a high score on it. He looked enthusiastic and literally glowed. However, the guys didn't look as happy. She pretended that she was really thinking, despite the fact that even before admission she had chosen all the subjects she was going to attend. The prince also asked Lihan what exactly they teach there. Lihan reported that he would only need to raise the star spirit mana stone that the professor had prepared and practice drawing a circle with it. The prince began to seem really interested, and Lihan continued to instructively explain, and victoriously informed that he had not said anything else. She and the prince were even more disappointed in Lihan. They began to assume whether he was a conman, and what could be so important here at all. Therefore, there was really something important for Lihan, namely that he would get his grades. She and the prince couldn't help but agree that Lihan was quite unusual. Of course, there was no need to talk about it with her views on life, but he was obsessed with profit to the point of insanity. Lihan was still somewhere in his thoughts when he informed the guys that if they were against it, then nothing could be done, and it was already time for him to go to the next, probably no less important for his easy life, subject. And the prince even became curious about what the next lesson he chose would be. Fencing became this subject. Fencing at the Academy of Magic. The courtyard at the southern entrance to the main building. There was a training ground for fencing students. Surprisingly, there were a lot more students in this place than previously in the dungeons. Moreover, they are all from the White Tiger Tower. The students of the White Tiger Tower are mostly from the houses of knights, which means they are good at fencing and take it extremely seriously. Lihan was thinking. He got the basics of magic combat on a platter with a blue border. Therefore, he was calm. After all, before entering the school, he repeatedly consistently practiced fencing. However, the students against his background began to immodestly whisper about whether he was from the Tower of the Blue Dragon, because he was still from the House of Vardanaz. Did he come here because his mentor taught him fencing for the sake of general development? It seemed to them a huge underestimate of fencing. Lihan knew that the knights were very proud of their skills, but he did not expect such hostility to the nobles. But it was absolutely unimportant, because they are teenagers after all. It was no longer possible for him to understand such an attitude towards someone who differs in simple origins. A tall green creature with pointed ears appeared from the archway. He was dressed in a white shirt, a grayish-purple raincoat and ordinary black trousers. He immediately turned to Lihan, asking if he was at home Vardanaz, who lives in the Blue Dragon Tower. This green creature turned out to be an orc. The man treated Lihan disdainfully, saying that serious fencing classes would be held here, and not training for beginners, so he probably made a mistake with the subject. For Lihan, such an attitude from peers did not become something unusual, so he simply thanked him for the information provided. However, the orc began to look even more aggressive, saying that they were not just waving swords here like aristocrats, but really busy. Lihan can be severely injured in sparring, because no one will give in. The guy told him that so be it. He would restrain himself in a fight with him so as not to hurt him too much. A soft cough sounded behind him. The man said that it would be nice if they got closer to him. He had a scar crossing his eye, and one of his legs was replaced with a metal one. He introduced himself as Professor Einrogard. This semester he will teach them fencing. However, the students were surprised that their professor would be an elf. It was quite unusual for such elegant and arrogant creatures. He was sure that before attending classes, each of the students had already been engaged in fencing, and came here to improve their skills or not to lose what they had already gained. Therefore, they decided to move on to working out existing skills, instead of learning the basics. Someone short with a light crown approached Lihan from behind and touched his shoulder with his hand. The guy turned around and saw a green-eyed elf with a yellow tie in front of him. He smiled at him affably, waving his hand. It looked like someone who was popular with girls. Today he was once again asked if he was a Lihan from the House of Vardanaz. The elf wondered why someone from the famous House of Malo came to learn how to wield a sword. It was obvious to Lihan that it was all for the sake of TGO, of course, so that it would be easier for this someone to earn good grades. Another person was shocked by Lihan's fervent speeches. It would seem that every day he disappoints an increasing number of people. He would have misunderstood if Lihan had told the truth, so it would be easier for both of them if he pretended that he only cared about grades. The guy introduced himself by the name of Jaisel. He was a native of the House of Morad. He could be called simply Morad. He looked like a sissy, but his calluses. Lihan said he was glad to meet him and shook the guy's hand. In fact, what else could you expect from people of his kind? The Morads strictly adhere to the rules and protect the North, being in harsh conditions. They are ready to resort to any means, methods and tricks to achieve their goals. That's how Lihan thought about them. But this guy was completely different from these ideas, shining like a ray of sunshine. Rumors are not always true, and perhaps they will even establish good friendly relations. The art of the blue stone sword is what Einrogard taught Lihan. Based on the name, you can guess that it is effective and easy to use. The training was so difficult that the nobles were reluctant to take up the bottom. However, Lihan managed to master them, because if you convince yourself that you can do it, then it will be so. The professor was surprised that Lihan used this particular sword art, as well as his good base, so he decided to find out which house he was from. The professor was surprised by his answer, since the house of Varnadaz did not specialize in fencing from the word at all. The elf decided to find out why he decided to study fencing. Lihan was convinced that this was a vital skill for an aristocrat. The professor's face assumed a typical professorial expression. If Lihan had said something else at that moment, he would have been about to say goodbye to good grades. Lihan only had to think about what exactly the professor would like to hear from him. Now he decided to speak differently. That as he progressed in his study, he realized that he could not have failed to come to this place, and he beamed, showing delight with all his appearance. The professor beamed in response. He realized that with Lihan's prerequisites for magic, he would make a serious swordsman. He takes fencing more seriously than the Tiger Tower students. The professor said that he understood something thanks to Lihan, so he would be as serious as possible with him. He pulled his sword out of its scabbard, shrouded in a greenish glow of magical energy under the shocked gaze of the guy. The professor ordered Lihan to get his wooden sword. Lihan expected absolutely not this. And how did it turn out like this? The sun was at its zenith, and Lihan was already lying on the ground exhausted, all flushed, in dusty and torn clothes. He clearly did not expect such an outcome from the lesson. The teacher was standing right above him. His whole figure seemed insanely threatening. He reported that the art of the blue stone is like a boulder. His strength is that he will not be shaken, no matter what happens to him. This is the art of the blue stone. He told Lihan not to forget about it. They're done for today. The professor finally turned his precious attention to another student. Lihan was leaving the playground, rubbing the clogged neck muscles. His whole body was tense and numb. How many times had he been hit at all during this friendly battle? He took good advantage of Lihan's gaps in defense, shouting weak spot, and gap every now and then. He was beaten until the very end of the fight. All this activity was far from a joke. In the future, it is the students from the Tiger Tower who will become knights, but he treated them more simply. If Einrogard is like an unshakable stone, then Einrogard is like a stream of water, and this is despite his prosthetic arms and legs. Moreover, as a professor, he knew all the arts and gave each student personal advice. When using the art of purple clouds, they should alternate hands more often. The difficulty of the two swords was that it was difficult to wield them and one should be thoughtful. The art of the top of the moon was fast and sharp. One should not be timid to make a strike. Anyway, Lihan understood everything, but why did it seem to him that he was beaten the most? The rest of the students sat quietly and chatted with each other after the battle, while it was hard for Lihan to even breathe once again. It was getting dark outside, which meant it was time to finish the lesson. The professor called Lihan to him. He immediately blew up and came over. He was worried that he had called him. Also, Derjiu from Choi's house was called, the same orc who was picking on Lihan even before the class started. He looked very angry and serious. It seems that this guy was only happy to prove to Lihan that he is worthless and he clearly does not belong here. The teacher said that the guys would conduct a duel without expressing any emotions towards any of the two guys. The students were shocked and did not understand why the professor chose them. There were whispers among the guys. The professor handed them the practice wooden swords, and Lihan kept getting annoyed by the smug face of the guy standing opposite. Obviously, he was waiting for this, because Lihan treated him too easily. People who were not distinguished by a strong mind always sought to compensate for this with fear and force. But now Lihan had no intention of retreating. He could spend time playfully, but he learned defense and received punches for the sake of just such moments. Around Lihan, his magical energy shone, giving freshness and shining with blue light. Einrogard chose them because they seemed the most capable, being bright opposites of each other. It is impossible to master the art of the sword through a tedious theory alone. Only by practicing many times and conducting real bomb can you see the path of the sword. For example, let's say they got the hang of getting to the enemy's neck so that the sword was right next to it. But if you don't have any other skills, then the enemy won't be so easily substituted. Noticing all your weaknesses, you use theory as a basis, and understanding and applied skills as a supporting factor, to extract all the absolute power of the great sword art. These two are not only able to reach this stage, but also put faint traces of magic into swords, which was something amazing for the freshmen. They were especially gifted as knights. The professor asked them to take their positions. Lihan had a good level of swordsmanship, regardless of which house he came from. He probably felt tremendous pressure from his home, but he is very serious about it. It seemed to the professor that Lihan's parents treated him as a disgrace to the family, since he, being from a kind of magicians, decided to devote his attention to such a barbaric art, according to the thoughts of many magicians, as swordsmanship. He was very worried about his ward and sympathized with his unfortunate fate. He considered Lihan incredibly capable and persistent, so he was ready to guide the guy along the path of owning a sword in order to help him forget about all the humiliations that his native home had brought him. He raised his hand for them to begin. He expected a lot from the fight that was about to begin. The art of the top of the moon houses my fast and furious, in contrast to it, the art of the blue stone, which is thorough and strong. Their fighting styles seem to reflect the characters of the heroes. However, the professor seems to have forgotten that a few hours earlier he had exhausted Lihan the most, which means that the guy was now terribly tired for such fights. Since the guys were absolute opposites of each other, they definitely had a lot to learn from each other. That's what opponents were needed for, so that by hitting you in weak spots, they teach you from mistakes. In the end, there really is no better teacher than a mistake. The orc defiantly asked Lihan if he was going to attack, but the guy did not react in any way. Then Manhwa quickly attacked first with a shout. He was surrounded by a huge amount of magical energy. The orc's sword stopped right in front of Lihan's face. He grimaced and jumped back, digging his toe into the ground, thereby raising dust directly into the face of the glasses. The students were shocked that Lihan really used the sand and even jumped up from their seats. They were also outraged as hell, so they began to ask the professor whether it was possible to do this and whether such an act did not contradict the rules of their duel. However, the professor was delighted with what was happening and said admiringly that it was amazing. The students were shocked by his behavior. It was as if he had entered the Lihan fan club and was an ardent fan. It didn't matter what methods the students resorted to. It was a deadly fight, which means it was important to get out of it alive and with fewer injuries than your opponent. Lihan understood exactly the meaning of these words, and therefore was ready to resort to any tricks in order to overcome mine. Every now and then he quickly went on the attack, not allowing the orc to recover. Now it was difficult for the descendants of knights to understand this. They were born in houses where honor is honored, so they will never be able to learn this. However, aristocrats now and then start playing friends with each other, but they can betray at any moment for the sake of profit. For them, wrestling has never been pure, so even in fencing, one could overlook this type of behavior. The students continued to whisper discontentedly, not understanding the meaning of what was happening. However, Lihan could stubbornly ignore the words of other people for the sake of victory. It was not difficult for him. He was a true swordsman. Choi also thought it was an extremely low trick. He underestimated Lihan for his kind and understood that he had made a clear mistake in this, because underestimating an opponent means losing. Lihan was in a guard from the ongoing battle, sinking into it with all his thoughts. He analyzed his opponent, his movements, thoughts, and emotions. He understood that the orc was still confused now, which meant that he should continue to advance to the last, putting the squeeze on him. Lihan initially understood that his opponent was very capable, so it was necessary to win with the mind, to create a scenario in which losing would be impossible. This meant the right atmosphere, the minute and second of the offensive. Lihan stepped on the orc's foot, continuing the attack, which caused him to fall back, almost falling under such pressure. Choi understood that this guy had gone very far, and then fell to the ground and rolled to the side. This brought Lihan out of emotional balance. He was surprised and perplexed by what had happened. After all, it's not often you see a big guy rolling on the ground and not rolling another one. Lihan couldn't verify that the orc had really given up so easily. For guys like him, losing was an incredible insult, but here he deliberately went for it, as if not realizing the consequences. Choi himself blushed, his face in the ground. He tried not to think about how he looked from the outside. However, the professor was delighted, his eyes were shining. He called the duel excellent, while the rest of the students were disappointed. They initially disliked Lihan, and now they were not going to establish relations. After all, this guy did not think about honor, but he did not even guess. The orc suddenly rose abruptly from the ground and attacked Lihan with a cry that he would never forgive him. In the end, his ego was extraordinarily hurt. Lihan dodged the wooden sword that was supposed to cut right between his eyes. A large amount of magical energy began to hover in the air, and the duel flared up with its former strength. The professor noted that these students were even several times better than he imagined. He watched what was happening with childish interest. He knew that they were capable, but he did not expect that he would demonstrate such a level of mastery of the art of the Moon Peak. But the harder he hits, the faster his stamina is consumed. Vardanaz, on the contrary, remains calm and only responds to the attacks of the enemy, leaving energy in reserve for the climax of the battle. The orc was too excited right now, but Lihan couldn't figure out where he was feeling such a strong pressure from. Lihan understood that now he needed to concentrate. Clutching his wooden sword, it was impossible to show emotions. He only needed to take advantage of the opportunity and win. The orc was bad at making decisions, because he did not expect such a turn of events. This led to constant mistakes. He performed unnecessary movements, hammering himself into a corner. Fencing, like any other sport, required full dedication and concentration. It took up all the time and absolutely all the attention, based on strategic thinking. It could probably be compared to chess. You should think not only about what you will do in the next minute, but also about what your opponent will do. In the end, here strength and intelligence required the same costs. In a duel between a trained genius and an equally trained idiot, of course, a genius would win. Emotions also played a significant role. When you show them too vividly, then you make mistakes every now and then, because your legs may start to tremble, your palms sweat, and your well-being deteriorates dramatically. Moreover, judging by the mana in Choi's sword and his sword, it is obvious that he is approaching the limit of his strength and physical abilities. Lihan did not get tired. Using only a little mana, his victory was only a matter of time. Choi was getting angrier by the second. Not understanding why the duel still did not stop, he complained that he was using insufficient force, completely ignoring the mistakes he made every now and then regarding protection. He couldn't understand why Lihan didn't get tired. He simply did not show emotions. Choi felt like a needle trying to prick the rock. This position was already a victory for Lihan. The orc internally surrendered, ready exclusively for defeat, although he did not recognize it. It was beginning to dawn on him that all the previous actions had played into Vardanaz's hands. Lihan knocked the sword out of the opponent's hands with one precise cutting blow of the sword, leaving him at a loss, and put the sword to his bare neck. The teacher came up to them, saying that was enough and the duel was finally over. He asked the students to come closer to him. The orc felt humiliated, not accepting defeat. If he had been a little calmer, things might have turned out differently. But Durju collapsed under the weight of pressure. Given his young age, it must be difficult to bear. Lihan already radiated the energy characteristic of a high-ranking aristocrat. The professor said that they both had a really great fight, but the victory was not 100%. He hoped that the winner would remain humble, and the loser would not stop persevering for the sake of his further growth. Now they should have shaken hands. However, there was a palpable tension in the air for everyone. Judging by the character of Choi, he would not be silent in any way. Lihan already began to think about how he could solve the problem in the event of an escalating conflict. But the orc only stretched out his palm to him with a good-natured expression and a subtle smile in his eyes. He apologized for being rude at the first meeting. He now believed that Lihan was more qualified to attend these classes than he was. Lihan continued to reflect. It didn't look like the orc was trying to lull his vigilance to attack. Apparently he really repented. Having a knightly honor, Vardanaz shook his hand in response, saying that for sure the orc said so only because he himself was worried. Tears of pride appeared in the professor's eyes. He began to clap, after which he turned to the other students, wondering why they decided that they could not do the same. There was a glorious moon shining in the sky, which shone only once a month. On such nights I wanted to sit on the roof and admire the beauty of nature. There was a mist in the air, enveloping the towers of the academy. Freshmen who attended today's fencing lesson gathered near the Tiger Tower. Jaisel stood in the very center, but his gaze was no longer as bright, but rather looked empty and ruthless. Opposite him was Choi, unhappy and downtrodden. Jaisel turned to him under the icy glances of others. He was sure that Durgo, as a student of the White Tiger Machine, he did not just plan to leave everything as it is after such a rude humiliation. The orc, on the other hand, looked confused. Bewilderment slipped on his face. He was sure that he had lost for the reason that he did not have enough skills. The guy from the crowd was indignant, because he believed that all this happened for the reason that Lihan cheated by throwing sand in the face of the glasses. Another young man assured Durso that he was not at all to blame for his loss. Nevertheless, Choi stood his ground. He believed that all this was solely due to a lack of abilities. Jazel said that this was absolutely not what was important here, dismissively waving his hand. He resented that the honor and pride of their tower was trampled solely because of him. None of the students were aware of the professor's thoughts on this matter, and therefore Durso became a weakling for them, who could not overcome an arrogant aristocrat who imagined himself to be who knows what. In their eyes, Lihan was still a brat from the Blue Dragon Tower, not respecting anyone around him. Jaisel said in an icy tone that Durgo would be held responsible for his actions. His eyes flashed lightning, and there was no trace of the benevolent boy. Still, he was exactly what Lihan imagined him to be, only he had much more hypocrisy to be able to make a good, kind Ray boy. The house of Mured ruled everything among the night houses. Choi asked in a trembling voice how exactly he would have to pay. Jaisel snapped his fingers. For him, everything was extremely simple. If you lose 1-on-1, defeat by numbers. Choi, who had a keen sense of justice, was shocked. Is this behavior worthy of a knight? Jaisel frowned even more. Such words seemed to him a sign of a loser. There was no such quality in his character at all as accepting a loss. Brought up by strict parents, he strove to achieve perfection in everything. In communicating with people, in earning reputation and authority, in fencing and leadership. Everything that could somehow, even indirectly, darken his reputation was sent to the scrap in the literal and figurative sense. There were whispers among the students. They had never heard anything like this. It seemed too much to them. Jaisel understood that DLO was getting out of control, and therefore he again assumed a benevolent expression. But the threat from the voice did not go away. It was not even going to. He said that if one of his dear fellow students did not agree, he could well tell him about it directly, and not whisper behind his back. It looks like Jaisel really was a crazy sociopath. Such people often become more likely to lie about themselves, taking the image of innocence. But the acceleration from rabbit to you're finished prey was incredibly fast. None of the students said a word. Choi was against it and was not going to take revenge. For him, this already marked the end. Jaisel had enough authority and power to turn his life into hell. The blonde called the orc a coward, saying that it looks like he will have to find a replacement for Choi. However, among the freshmen there were many who would gladly have carried out the revenge themselves. Vardanaz is certainly capable, but it was simply unprofitable to fight against three, not to mention that they are members of the houses of knights who train every day. Choi just couldn't turn a blind eye to it. He believed that this was not how future knights should behave. It didn't matter to him what consequences his actions would incur. He was completely ready to take Lihan's side, without looking at the consequences. Choi ran headlong to Vardanaz. However, when he arrived at the place, he found his fellow student lying on the ground with an abrasion on the back of his head. Chaos was going on around, consisting of the magical energy of Lihan. He turned to the other students who were lying in wait for him, saying that if they wanted to die, they could come closer. He threw lightning with his eyes, and stones with the power of mana. Choi was shocked by what he saw, could not understand what was wrong here. Some time ago, 3 disciples from the Tiger Tower surrounded Lihan in the middle of the forest in the dead of night. They turned to him talking about whether he thought that nothing would happen after he spoiled an honest duel with his deceitful actions. They said they would make sure that Lihan would never be able to come to this subject again. Was it really only because of what happened in the duel? Alikan decided to scare them. He turned around, shooting them a look. He told them if they were doing it, regardless of which house he was from. The students were even more annoyed if he really decided to simply intimidate them, boasting of the high position of his kind. Did he expect them to retreat because of this? However, they all faded away and looked at each other. Would they have something because of this? Apparently there was someone behind them, since they had come here so calmly, someone who could take care of them in case of anything. If they had at least half a brain, then, for a start, they would not get involved in something like this. He sternly asked the question of who sent them, whether this was some great house whose orders could not be ignored. The guys immediately felt horror. One of the students ordered Lihan to shut up, and the rest did not listen to him. He also ordered Varnadaz to be surrounded to prevent him from escaping. 3 against 1 is a lot. Einrogard told him to run if he suddenly got involved in something like this. Young master, when the lies outnumber you, the best thing you can do is run away. But the way to retreat was closed. Now I had to think about what was worth doing. Then he lowered his eyes to the floor, noticing the stones, thought about whether it was worth using them. Their size was almost like the pen that he used during the execution of the director's assignment. He lifted the stones up from the ground. The students were horrified, realizing that he seemed to be able to use magic. They realized that the Varnadas seemed to be really different from ordinary people. It was enough to scare them, Lihan exhaled. It was just necessary not to slow down and get out of here. He ordered them to get out of the way, otherwise. His magic seemed to direct the stone towards one of the guys. He crashed with all his might. Almost the same as the feather did that day when it cut through an apple in the garden opposite the auditorium. Varnadas himself did not understand how this could happen. The guys looked at their fallen comrade in horror. Lihan had not planned this at all. The students of the Tiger Tower, even more angry, turned to Lihan. They were scared, but tried not to show it. It was a shock to them how quickly Lihan launched that stone that they could not even react to what had happened. Even though he was a native of the Varnadas family, they still could not believe that he already has such power of magic. His eyes were shining, and a lot of magical energy was concentrated around him. He had not planned this, but so be it. He uttered the cherished remark that if they want to die, they cannot hesitate to come closer. Lihan tried very hard to keep an absolutely unperturbed look. They were annoyed, but nevertheless shamefully ran away, promising that Lihan would not get away with it. Choi was in a terrible absolute shock from what he had just seen. He did not expect such strength from Lihan, although he noticed that he was terribly talented. Lan let out a disappointed sigh, looking at the glasses out of the corner of his eye. He asked if he had come here to fight, but Choi reported that this was not the case. Lihan made a mistake in the name, as it turned out, not the guy at all, but the girl, calling her Giselle instead of Giselle, while the orc told him everything that had happened. The Tower of the White Tiger was very different from the Tower of the Blue Dragon, where each clan was noble and quite powerful, so all the gatherings in their tower were more like a social event to which those were accustomed from early childhood. There was always a distance between them, even in moments of close communication. No unnecessary displays of emotions, no lines of movements and glances. He could not have imagined that a hierarchy had already been established in the Tiger Tower. It couldn't help but disappoint. The orc drew a portrait of a girl on the ground and Lihan immediately recognized her as the guy who addressed him in fencing class. He thought she was good-natured at that moment, but it seems that her appearance was deceptive. Lihan sat down thoughtfully, holding his chin with his hand. Appearance and character were not connected in any way. Apparently, they were telling the truth about handsome men. That's why Lihan believed that he would never become one. It looks like the guy didn't listen to Choi at all anymore. The orc was surprised that Lihan called Giselle a guy. Did he really think she was a guy? Lihan kept thinking, was this really the reason why Giselle turned to him? It seemed strange to Lihan how those students reacted to the duel. Choi explained that the duel was only an excuse, but there were many reasons. First, Lihan came from the house of Varnadas. If he, a native of a great family, could be defeated, then Giselle's authority among the first-year students would grow dramatically. Lihan frowned. He realized that Giselle had used him only as a trophy with which to raise her authority. It wasn't good. Oka was worried that Lihan would most likely continue to show his good side. Then the students from the White Tiger Tower would feel hostility towards the young man. Giselle knows how to ignite these emotions. She has always shown herself to be a true manipulator. The orc just wanted Lihan to know about everything and be careful if he decides to continue attending fencing. The Blue Dragon Tower shone with a soft, friendly light, reflecting the glow of the moon. The fog in the sky has cleared. Lihan was preparing to go inside, but he kept thinking about what he had heard. The orc asked him to avoid those subjects that the students of the White Tiger Tower attend, in which case Giselle will not be able to do anything to him. It certainly wasn't a bad suggestion, and Choi's concern was pleasant to him, but he wouldn't have thought to follow this advice ever in his life. After all, he wasn't aiming to become a scared rabbit at all. He needed this subject for the sake of getting good grades, which means no Giselle could have prevented it. The first reason is that it was hard to find a good subject in Lihan's understanding. The second reason is pride. It seems that among the nobles it was eaten at the genetic level. It simply could not be avoided. How dare they play political games with Lihan? Recreation room. The students of the Blue Dragon Tower sat incredibly dejected. Lihan stumbled into the living room with tears in his eyes, as well as bruises and abrasions all over his body from somewhere. He, crying, said that he was attacked by students from the White Tiger Tower just because he was from the Blue Dragon. Now all that remained was to see how the aristocrats would react to this. They were shocked. Their pride and self-esteem were hurt. They immediately exploded with anger, asking if they had lost their minds. The guy with blue hair shouted that now was not the time to sit there. They urgently needed to call everyone upstairs. They said that it would be fine for Gainando, but they raised their hand against Lihan. The prince himself was shocked by this situation, at least by the fact that he was somehow attracted to all this. Lihan was surprised. They were much more angry than he had imagined. Instructions continued to fly around the room. Contact the others. Do we have an opportunity to get some kind of weapon? Get to work. Lihan told them not to go that far, but they just waved him off, saying that they already owed him a lot. Each of them tasted the meat that he brought. If not for him, they would have starved to death altogether. Lihan's conscience ached because he was only trying to earn money at their expense. They lined up in a line of 2 and were going to go kill the jerks from the White Tiger Tower. Lihan made a terrible mistake in the calculation and underestimated how much the Blue Dragon Tower hates the White Tiger Tower. It is quite natural to hate someone in whom you notice your equal more and more. However, Asan shouted to the whole room to stop. He was standing on the table and asked them to listen to what he was going to tell them now. He said that it is impossible to act rashly. People from the families of knights live in that tower. If they rush there on emotions, they will definitely lose. Lihan confirmed Asan's words, but then the guy shouted that they should ambush and only then attack. This decision was truly worthy of the Report family. All the aristocrats supported it. Lihan realized that it was foolish to hope for anything. The young man shouted to them that they should not rush because he did not ask them to take revenge at all. It was only about his honor, so he would figure it out for himself. However, the students continued to be indignant because the members of the White Tiger Tower are cunning, mean and petty, so it will be difficult to cope with such scum. Lihan was amazed at how simply the guy cursed them without even blinking an eye. It was quite in the style of the nobles. Lihan objected that they all come from noble families, and wouldn't it be a shame to be like the natives of the White Tiger Tower? If it was necessary to think from such a side, then the freshmen were ready to moderate their interest. Lihan was very glad that his idea finally worked. However, if they themselves come into conflict with them, then together they will answer they were cowards, so they will surely attack the group surreptitiously. The students beamed, saying that he was right and they really would just stick together and be alert. So the problem of bullying for belonging to some family was avoided. The next lesson at the Blue Dragon Tower coincided with the White Tiger Tower, so the freshmen decided to make sure that they could not live there in peace. This scared Lihan even more.